Good evening and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana, 104.5 FM and UPTV. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I'm here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU or UCIMC, or, as we like to say on this show, UPTV, because we also broadcast there. So, back again. Last we spoke, we were going through our review of immigration views of Americans, and now we're on to just regular news again, because that finished. But that was very interesting, and I'd like to find more things like that in the future. Anyway, the first article we're going to read through today is called "The Census Shows the U.S. Needs to Increase Immigration by a Lot." Candidates for U.S. citizenship. Sorry, no, that's something else. These things are confusing sometimes. That's a description of the photo that goes with this article, but it's in the same type as everything else. So it just says, candidates for U.S. citizenship listen to the presiding field officer during a naturalization ceremony. Okay, well, that's good. The results of the 2020 census are a warning sign that America is on a course for slow population growth. Economists broadly agree that population growth fuels economic growth in wealthy countries, but the recently released census figures show the U.S. population was 331.5 million people, an increase of just 7.4% between 2010 and 2020, the lowest rate since the 1930s. Projections suggest that unless current trends change, those numbers could continue to diminish dramatically over the next 2 to 3 decades, with the population growing by just 78 million by 2060. Some parts of the U.S. are already beginning to experience some of the downsides of population slowdown or decline. Shrinking tax bases in rural areas have made it harder for government budgets to support essential services, such as infrastructure and public schools. As population growth slows, the pressure for cuts will likely grow. Meanwhile, the existing population will continue to age. By 2030, the Census Bureau estimates that 1 in 5 U.S. residents will be of retirement age. Slow population growth, at least in the United States and a lot of other developed countries, will become a dire age dependency problem. William Frey, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program, said. It puts a big strain on the rest of the population. There are ways the policymakers can turn the situation around. The Biden administration has advocated for family-friendly policies that could make it easier for Americans to have more children, but that will not be enough to overcome a widening gap in the number of working-age adults that are able to support an aging population of baby boomers. That leaves immigration, which has historically insulated the U.S. from population decline and represents a kind of tap that the U.S. can turn on and off. Over the next decade, it is set to become the primary driver of population growth for the first time in U.S. history. The question now is exactly how much more immigration might be needed to accelerate population growth, and whether U.S. policymakers can actually overcome their political differences on the issue to make it an effective tool. Immigration is one of the most feasible and rational ways to help respond to this challenge, and we know that will have a really significant impact, Danilo Zak, a senior policy and advocacy associate for the National Immigration Forum, said. There are 2 main ways that the U.S. could increase overall population growth, by encouraging people to have more children or by increasing immigration levels. On their own, pro-natalist policies have historically failed to increase birth rates in the kinds of numbers that would be required to stave off stagnant population growth. Internationally, research has shown that child allowances have led to slight, short-lived bumps in birth rates. From 2007 to 2010, Spain had a child allowance that led to a temporary 3% increase in birth rates, but that was mostly because more people decided to have children earlier, rather than have more of them. After the allowance was revoked, the birth rate decreased 6%. President Biden has proposed his $1.8 trillion American Families Plan, which would cap child care payments for parents earning up to 1.5 times the median income for their state, guarantee 12 weeks of paid parental leave, and maintain a new enhanced child tax credit for another 4 years. The kind of policies that might make it easier for families to have children. But even so, the U.S. isn't likely to see the kind of baby boom of the 1950s and 60s when the population was overall very young and a high percentage of women were in their childbearing years. Pro-family policies are important, but it's proven pretty hard to get people to have more children when they don't want to, Zach said. Immigration is a much more reliable driver of population growth. The average age of newly arriving immigrants is 31, which is more than 7 years younger than the median American, meaning they could help replace an aging workforce. They are also more entrepreneurial, which encourages economic dynamism, and more likely to work in essential industries such as healthcare, transportation, construction, agriculture, and food processing. Immigrants may also help stave off regional population declines. Immigrants are more likely to settle in areas where foreign-born populations already live, which are typically large metro areas that have lost population in recent years. Frey found in a 2019 report that, of the 91 large metro areas that have gained population since the beginning of the decade, 15 would have actually lost population were it not for immigration, including New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia. In another 11 large metro areas, immigration accounted for more than half of their population growth. Refugees are also more likely to settle in less dense population centers where housing costs are lower, possibly reinvigorating the nearly 35% of rural counties in the U.S. that have experienced significant population loss in recent decades. Raising immigration levels wouldn't necessarily require a major reimagining of the U.S. immigration system, though that might offer more flexibility to reevaluate immigration levels periodically. It could be accomplished by just increasing the caps on existing forms of visas and green cards. Legal immigration is not something that's been discussed very much, Frey said. I hope these census numbers will force people to think about being more serious about that. To really reap the benefits of increased immigration, though, the U.S. would have to ensure that immigrants have the ability to integrate, which it has done successfully in the past. Immigrants in the U.S. already have a higher employment rate and labor participation rate than native-born citizens, and immigrant children tend to perform at or above the educational level of comparable U.S.-born children. In recent years, states and cities have adopted a patchwork of policies to promote immigrant integration, including programs designed to provide English classes, schooling, and professional training, resources to start businesses, and access to citizenship. But Biden has reestablished an Obama-era task force on new Americans to expand the role of the federal government in such initiatives. We need to figure out how to give those young people the opportunities for success, Frey said. It's hard to estimate just how many more immigrants the U.S. would need to accept annually in order to reverse its slow population growth trend. In recent history, before President Donald Trump pursued policies curbing immigration and global travel largely came to a halt during the pandemic, the U.S. typically admitted more than 1 million immigrants per year. But under that scenario, census projections indicate that the U.S. would see less than half the population growth between 2020 and 2060 that it saw over the previous 40 years. Some have argued that the U.S. should try to set its immigration levels equal to its historical per capita rate of immigration, or to the per capita immigration rates of comparable countries, such as Australia or Canada. Others have argued that the U.S. shouldn't set immigration levels at all, and instead let the market decide how many people are needed to fulfill the needs of employers. But Zach said that all of those methods seem somewhat arbitrary and unlikely to spur members of Congress to action. In his research with the National Immigration Forum's president and CEO Ali Noorani, he argues that the U.S. should increase net immigration levels by at least 37%, or about 370,000 additional immigrants a year, to prevent a demographic deficit stemming from low population growth. That number of immigrants, they estimate, would maintain the current old age dependency ratio, the OADR, I never knew that was a thing, which is the number of people ages 16 and 64 per person over age 65. Basically, the number of workers available to support one retired person. It's generally considered to be a good indicator of the demographic health of a country. Today, the U.S.'s ratio is 3.5, down from 5.4 in 2005 and 6.4 in 1965. By comparison, Japan has an OADR of 2.1, the lowest worldwide, and is scrambling to shore up the viability of basic services for its aging population, such as public pensions, health care, and long-term care systems. Even just maintaining the U.S.'s current ratio may not be enough to avert the problems associated with an aging population, but it provides a preliminary benchmark for members of Congress who, in an ideal world, would reevaluate immigration levels every few years. The last time the U.S. significantly increased legal immigration levels was with the Reagan-era Immigration Reform Act of 1986. When we talk about maintaining the current OADR, it's a conservative judgment, hoping to at least stop the bleeding, Zach said. We look at it as an initial target rather than a cap. We don't want things to get significantly worse. America doesn't necessarily need to be picky with regards to the kinds of immigrants it seeks to welcome. The U.S. might need more workers to help fill growing labor shortages associated with demographic decline, as well as more immigrants who are sponsored by their family members to ensure that immigration populations feel comfortable putting down roots in the U.S. and having children. The children of immigrants will be a major driver of population growth in the long term. But immigrants in general, including refugees and asylum seekers, carry the benefit of boosting population in rural areas that are feeling the brunt of the effects of demographic decline. When it comes to responding to demographic needs, too many needs in here. Okay, let me try that again. When it comes to responding to demographic needs, that really needs to emphasize all different kinds of immigrants and the value they all bring to the country and to help us respond to the demographic challenges we face, Zach said. Not sure I understand it. But the U.S. could also take a more targeted approach by addressing existing labor shortages in industries such as home health care, hospitality, transportation, and construction. The Labor Department has a list of occupations with shortages, making it easier for employers to bring immigrants to the U.S. to fill those jobs, but it hasn't been updated in many years. Currently, just physical therapists, nurses, and artists and scientists with exceptional ability qualify as shortage occupations. We need to do an even better job of figuring out where our labor shortages are going to be in the coming years, Zach said. The U.S. can fill those shortages with a range of flexible visa programs. Lawmakers have already weighed creating a state-based visa that would allow states to select what kinds of immigrants they will accept based on their specific labor needs. Representative John Curtis, with the blessing of Utah's Republican then-Governor Gary Herbert, introduced a related bill in 2019 under which each state would get an average of 10,000 visas a year and would be able to determine how long they last and how often they could be renewed. But the U.S. could also look for policy solutions abroad. Wealthy countries such as Australia have adopted visas for immigrants who can fill national labor shortages, and Canada created its provincial nominee program to encourage immigration to provinces that are experiencing labor shortages. These kinds of increases in new legal immigration can be used in tandem with programs to legalize the estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants already living in the U.S. Researchers from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania found that the provisions in Biden's comprehensive immigration reform proposal, granting legal status to undocumented immigrants, would increase the size of the U.S. population by more than 4% by 2050. That's because it would decrease their likelihood of emigrating and increase their birth rates. There's no doubt that we should be pursuing all of these ideas to help us respond to what's really one of the most pressing challenges the country will face over the next several decades, Zach said. Well, good luck with that. It's really frustrating to realize how much a part ideology plays in a lot of the decisions that are being made about things like that. So there are people who are ideologically opposed to immigration, and therefore they don't care that we need immigrants. And this article very clearly explains why that is very helpful and why it would be important to this country and to our future to increase immigration. But there are people who are just fundamentally against immigration, regardless of whether it's a good idea or not. And they're just going to fight against these things no matter what. And that's really unfortunate. It's counterproductive and self-defeating, but hey, you know, that's your ideology. That's what you believe in. You're going to fight for it, whether it makes sense or not. Okay. Here goes another one of those it's obvious stories. This is entitled Correcting Misperceptions About and Increasing Empathy for Migrants. We read one of these about once a month or so. And I always wonder if the people that write them are unaware that there's a whole group of people that I was just talking about that don't want to hear about this. They don't want their misperceptions corrected because they don't care about what the facts are. They care about how they feel, and so it doesn't matter. But anyway, we'll read it anyway. We'll see. Maybe there's some good ideas here. Many mainstream depictions of immigration at the United States southern border paint a dark picture, eliciting imagery of violent gang members and child trafficking. But how many undocumented immigrants are really involved in this kind of activity? Many people may be surprised to learn the answer is far fewer than they think. A new study from the Peace and Conflict Neuroscience Lab at the Annenberg School for Communications. I have never heard of the PCNL, the Peace and Conflict Neuroscience Lab. Anyway, the PCNL found that Americans dramatically overestimate the number of migrants affiliated with gangs and children being trafficked, and that this overestimation contributes to dehumanization of migrants, to lack of empathy for their suffering, and to individuals' views on immigration policy. In addition, the researchers developed and tested interventions to address this misinformation and increase empathy for undocumented immigrants. We noticed that false narratives about undocumented immigrants as criminals or as having criminal intentions are commonly circulated in the public, says Samantha Moore Berg, PCNL postdoctoral fellow and lead author of the study. We were curious about the impact of these narratives on attitudes towards immigrants and immigration policy support, and whether by correcting these narratives, we are able to foster more positive attitudes towards immigrants. The study aimed to compile data on Americans' misperceptions of immigrants, motivations for crossing the southern border, determine if those misperceptions impacted Americans' policy positions, and develop successful interventions for addressing misperceptions and increasing empathy. Study participants, on average, estimated that 15% of migrants at the southern border are affiliated with gangs, and 25 to 35% of children at the southern border are being used as props by adults who are not their parents for immigration purposes. In reality, the Department of Homeland Security suspects approximately 1% of immigrants have gang connections, and less than 0.1% of children are being trafficked. The researchers found that participants' erroneous beliefs about immigrants impacted their views on immigration policy and caused them to view immigrants with less empathy and to dehumanize them more. However, after a successful intervention, which included viewing the correct statistics on immigrant behavior and watching an emotional video of an immigrant parent and child being reunited after the U.S. separated them at the border, participants' levels of empathy for immigrants increased, their dehumanization of immigrants decreased, and their support of less punitive immigration policy increased. By both correcting these false narratives about immigrants and unlocking empathy towards them, we were able to foster more positive attitudes towards immigrants and encourage greater support for more humane immigration policies, Moorburg says. This gives us hope that by shifting narratives about immigrants to be both more accurate and empathetic, we can ultimately foster greater acceptance of immigrants. Well, I hate to be cynical, but we went just on our survey of Americans' attitudes towards immigrants. We talked about this, and I spoke at length on a number of occasions about how people were misguided, and a lot of their attitudes about immigration, their negative attitudes about immigration, were based on misperceptions and ignorance and a lack of understanding generally. And I can't count the number of times we've discussed how these misperceptions and the false narratives that circulate about them are being promulgated by bad actors, let's say, by people who benefit from keeping this problem, this sense of immigrants as being dangerous or evil or somehow unhealthy for America. Keeping those things alive is what keeps alive certain politicians and people that prey on vulnerable folks. For example, let's collect money to build a wall at the southern border. Well, that's not, you're not collecting money from people that know what's going on. You're collecting money from people that don't know what's going on, who are confused and misled about what's going on. And if you're collecting money from them, you do not want them to have these false narratives explained away to them. You want them to continue to believe that. So, I mean, perhaps these people understood this and are just being diplomatic about how they describe it. But honestly, the situation is not going to get better by trying to educate people about this topic. It's going to get better by somehow undoing the benefits that accrue to those who are keeping the false narratives alive. I mean, I've been doing this show for years and trying to educate people. And granted, I have a very small audience, but that's partly because the appetite for actual honest information about immigration is fairly low compared to the appetite for rabble-rousing and, fire-breathing commentary on the topic from people who would rather mislead you and keep you angry and scared. So I'm not sure how useful a study like this is going to be. I mean, I already knew this. You, excuse me, the listener, almost undoubtedly, if you bother to listen to this show, you already knew that it's people's misperceptions about immigration that fuel a lot of the negativity and a lot of the political posturing on the topic. How to change that? I'm not sure. I don't know how to disconnect the people that benefit from that misinformation from the people who are the victims of it, or the dupes, or what have you. Anyway, I don't know. I don't like to be negative, but I don't see how knowing that's going to help, because we already know it. Everybody knows it, or everybody that knows anything about this knows it. And I don't know, another study saying that, yes, you're right, is not really getting us anywhere. Anyway, I'm going to move on because I'm just being negative, I guess. All right, the next one. Opinion. How Democrats can take control of the immigration debate. Okay, this is good. Let's see from this person, whose name I somehow don't have here, how they think Democrats can take control of the immigration debate. After receiving weeks of criticism from Republicans that she was not eager enough to visit the U.S.-Mexico border and, presumably, stage the appropriate photo ops, Vice President Harris went there on Friday, where she communicated that the Biden administration is greatly concerned and has things under control. This message will be greeted with yet more faux outrage from the opposition, which will continue to insist that we are facing an immigration crisis, a message that will be dutifully repeated by the news media. While Republicans have somewhat shifted their focus in recent days, they've now convinced themselves that fear-mongering about the phantom of critical race theory, rather than fear-mongering about immigration, is their real key to winning back power. The politics of immigration remain essentially unchanged. Republicans are aggressive and confident, always sure that whatever gets their base afraid and angry is good for them, while Democrats are tentative and uncertain, always afraid of what might anger people who probably aren't going to vote for them anyway. This is why some immigration advocates are trying to convince Democrats they need to go on offense on the immigration issue. Hey, this person is speaking my language. That's the message of some new polling from a coalition of immigration groups surveying voters in battleground states, which finds that even though immigration policies favored by Democrats are overwhelmingly popular, President Biden's approval on immigration is pretty poor. Just 36% approve of his performance on the issue, while 57% disapprove. And why would we expect voters to think Biden is doing a great job on the issue? Ask yourself. What has the average American heard when it comes to Biden and immigration? The administration has a blueprint for immigration policy and has even written a piece of reform legislation, but hasn't done much to communicate them to the public. If 1 in 100 people could accurately tell you what Biden wants to do, it would be a shock. Meanwhile, the news has been filled with stories about a crisis at the border. To a typical observer, it looks like Biden isn't really handling things well and doesn't have any ideas about what to do next. In fact, Biden is seeking a broad reversal of the Trump administration's policies, which were all focused on restricting legal immigration so that it would be as difficult and time-consuming as possible for anyone to come to the United States. Biden would streamline the system to increase the number of immigrants coming through a variety of pathways and provide a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, especially dreamers, those brought to the United States as children, and improving conditions and administrative processes for those who arrive at the border.